So the first question I obviously have to ask everyone is, who's excited about IE9? Come on, seriously, put up the hands. Now, of course I am, but I'm a little bit biased given that I work on the team. But to give myself a little bit more credibility, I've also been a web developer for quite a while. I actually started working on web pages about 12 years ago, and I've spent my fair share of time in the trenches figuring out and working around cross-browser differences and just getting things to work right everywhere my users are visiting my sites. Now, specifically today, I want to talk about a number of these best practices. Now, I'm curious, who attended Damien and Tatham's session on kind of, oh good, there's some people in the background there. They did some good discussion around progressive enhancement, graceful degradation. I'll focus on some more specific aspects in this presentation. Now, of course, as we all know, life as a web developer is a bit hard. And I'm specifically going to walk through cross-browser challenges for web developers, a set of do's, and a set of don'ts. Specifically, web developers have to deal with many different browsers: Firefox, IE, Safari, other flavors of WebKit. I apologize. What? Oh, thank you. Excuse me for just a second. Hopefully this will clear up the static. Better? Yeah. Fantastic. So yeah, IE, Firefox, many other different flavors of WebKit, many different versions of each of those browsers. And new versions are released frequently. In the last year alone, every single major browser vendor released a new version. And this becomes somewhat of a challenge for dealing with this moving platform, this moving target that you want to get your websites to run on. But it's a key goal of the IE team to help you enable that. That's why we've been talking so much about the same markup, getting your same HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to run that you can use in the other browsers. And I'll go into a lot more of the specifics about how that works. Oh, wrong direction. So first, I actually want to jump straight into a demo with a new feature. Are most people here familiar with rounded corners from CSS3? Good. I just want to kind of show you what the experience today is in that case. So I've got the IE9 platform preview, Firefox, Opera, Chrome, and Safari. And I've just set up kind of a basic page with a div, some borders, and what I want to go do is add some rounded borders to my site. So if I go in here to edit, I've left myself a little to-do. Now, given that I've read the CSS spec, I'm going to go ahead and just add border radius, and I'll set it to something like 20 pixels. Now, the interesting question becomes how this works when I go and actually test this across different browsers. So I'll refresh in IE9, and I get rounded corners like I expect. In Chrome, I get the same. But as I move across some of the different browser implementations and refresh, you'll see that Opera does as well, but I'm not getting my rounded corners on Safari and Firefox. Now, people that have dealt with this before are well aware that vendors that do early adoption typically use vendor prefixes. And so, since Firefox and Safari have actually had early support of rounded borders, I need to use their vendor prefixed versions to get it to work, as they haven't supported the unprefixed version yet. So with that change, I should be pretty good to go ahead and load up. And now I've got my rounded corners. So fairly simple. Now, what if I want to do something a little bit more complex? How many people are aware that you can actually set each individual border individually? Great. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to set like 5, 5, 50, 50. And I'll just copy this over so that each different syntax has it. Now let's go back and check what that looks like in the browsers. So I've got the 2 5s at the top, the 50s at the bottom in IE. Same in Firefox, Opera, and Chrome. But in Safari, I didn't quite get what I expected. That's because there's more different between these properties than simply having a vendor prefix. They actually have slightly different levels of support for syntax. Now, this is what we were talking about before, where standards are sometimes a bit of a moving target before they've been fully ratified. And so when some of these prefixes have been introduced, the standards were at a different stage and different forms of the syntax weren't supported. So to actually go ahead and get this to work in Safari, I have to go and break them out into 4 separate statements. Now, I won't make you watch me write all that, so I've saved up a nice little copy here. But if I go and do that replacement, then I can get the behavior that I'm looking for. All right, so my key point is this. Working with different features in different browsers, even with the latest standards, is a hard problem. Like, browsers adopt things at different rates, and they're going to have differences in their implementations until things stabilize over time. But there are things that you can do as a web developer to help shield yourself against those differences. Now, the key point of this really comes down to how you choose what you're going to run where. The CSS example I just showed works quite nicely due to the way that CSS naturally does fallback. The browsers just pick up on what they support, and they ignore what they don't. But when you're working with something in script, which is often more commonly the case, you generally are doing a more explicit detection. And this is really what matters most when we're talking about the same markup, determining what your site's actually going to use depending on where it's running. Now, early on, a lot of people would use what we call version detection. They'd go, okay, I know that this browser supports this set of features, and so I'm going to go ahead and detect what browser it is, use the features I know it supports, and then keep doing that for each browser in my test matrix. Now, the specific thing here is that what you end up with are pieces of codes specifically targeted at given browser implementations. Now, we moved on to something called object detection, where instead of perhaps looking at the user agent string, we would end up looking at different objects that we knew one browser had over or another. Document.all has been a clear indication of IE for some time. But you're still effectively doing the same thing. It's browser-specific, browser-targeted code. Now, what's come up in more recent years as a strong recommendation is to do something called feature detection. This is where you're actually looking not for a specific browser, but for whether that browser you're currently running in supports the feature you want to use. So in this case, I'm not looking for browser X and browser Y. I'm checking whether a browser supports add event listener, and then falling back to some alternative code that I have in cases where it doesn't. Now, this brings me to the set of best practices that I'm really wanting to get across as part of this presentation. Specifically, that you, when you're writing your site, should do feature detection and what I refer to as behavior detection. It's just a more specialized form. I'll get into more detail later. And specifically, avoid detecting specific browsers or assuming unrelated features, because just because a browser has feature X and Y today doesn't necessarily mean new browsers that add X are going to add Y at the same time. The key thing here is the impact is it reduces your own maintenance cost on your sites. With browser detection, you don't know what the next version is going to hold, and so you're always playing a guessing game in terms of, well, when the next version of IE or Firefox comes out, do I still need to send it down this code path, or do I need to send it down the other one? With feature detection, your site will automatically adapt based on the features there in the browser. So you just continue to progressively work as new releases come out instead of having to go and recode your site. So I want to talk a little bit more about feature detection. Specifically, the key is to test for a feature before using it. Now, obviously, this is overly cumbersome if you're trying to do this across the entire platform. Like, if I had to test for every single API that I wanted to use, my web page would just become unmanageable. Plus, having an alternate code path for each of those is unreasonable. So it's really not as critical for features that have been well established. Like, as web developers, what's been available in the market and what things you can really use. Like, get element by ID, not that big of a risk in terms of basic usage. Add event listener, something that's more recently been added to IE9, and so you want to make sure you do the detection properly. More importantly is you want to test for standards first. You always want to be using standards API, standards features where they're supported. So you avoid accidentally using legacy functionality if a browser has a bit of a hybrid model. So let's go ahead and start with a bit more of a JavaScript-oriented example. So this is add event listener that I was just talking about. This piece of code will hook me up to get an onload event in IE9, Firefox, Safari, Opera, all the latest browsers. Of course, I want to make sure that I add proper feature detection for it so that I can fall back to alternative approaches, such as for legacy IE. Now, let me go ahead and just show you a little bit of how this works in practice. I'll switch back over to the demo machine. And I think we can take some of these out of here now. And so what I want to do is open up a file that I've set up a little bit ago and go ahead and bring you to the source code. So I've got some functions I've set up, and I've got a to-do here to go ahead and register for an onload notification. Now, if I go ahead and just window add event listener, load, I'll do my F1 since I'm actually using add event listener and I'm not going to use capture. Then if I go back to the IE9 platform preview in Firefox, we can see we actually get our event and we're adding something to the page saying the add event listener was used. Now if you're in 8 mode, which I'll go ahead and force here, you'll see that I get a script error because add event listener wasn't supported at that point in time. So I want to make sure I do proper feature detection and fallback. Now, if I just did this, I get rid of the error, but of course I don't actually have any code that's running. So given that I know the best practice here, key thing is that you add on for names in legacy versions of IE. And I'm going to go ahead and hook it up to my other functions so I can tell when I'm running one or the other. Now this one's still in 8 mode, so you'll see I was using attach event. But since I checked for add event listener first, when my page is running in 9 mode, I actually go ahead and I'm taking advantage of the standardized APIs. So not only am I using the same markup, but I'm executing the same code in the same way across browsers. And that's a really key aspect of what I'm trying to show here today. So now I want to talk a little bit about behavior detection. Because sometimes it's not as simple as just whether a browser has a given API or not. Practically, there are bugs in browsers, and it's a real thing that web developers have to deal with. Now, basic feature detection, as I mentioned, is going to fail to identify these sorts of issues because it's only going to tell you if the API is there or not. So the solution here is to run a small test to detect the broken behavior as opposed to just saying, if IE7 or if IE8 or if Firefox or if Safari. And then you want to apply a workaround only when you've detected that the broken behavior is present. Now, this pattern in practice looks a little something like this. And this is just pseudocode. I'm running some sort of test that I've predefined that's going to detect the known issue. And if the test didn't pass, then I'll go ahead and apply the workaround. Now, I want to show you how this looks a little bit in practice using getElementById, API I think we're all familiar with. Because there were some changes made in the IE8 timeframe to how this behaved. So with getElementById in particular, IE7 and IE6 actually did case-insensitive matching of IDs instead of case-sensitive, which is appropriate. This was fixed in IE8, but if I want to go ahead and do some sort of a test to detect whether that behavior is there so I can appropriately handle it in my site, I can just go ahead and try to hit the problem area. So let me walk through the specifics of what I'm doing here, just to explain it in more detail. So I've got a script here that's just creating an element. I'm getting basically a unique timestamp so I don't have to worry about conflicting with anything on the current page. And I'm setting that to the ID of the element I just created and then adding it to the page. Then I'll go ahead and use the API that I know has the broken behavior to try to retrieve something specifically in a different case than what was originally specified. And I remove the element later just so that it doesn't impact anything negatively. By checking if I actually got the result, I can just set a flag up front and early so that I already know I've already detected whether this behavior exists. This flag is something that I can use later in my code to pivot as appropriate. And things like these are actually provided by a lot of popular libraries. jQuery in particular has an API called jQuery.support, which runs a number of these tests as part of when jQuery is loading. So you can go ahead, if you're using jQuery, and go take advantage of these in your own site. The key thing being you don't have to go write the test yourself. Now, I'll just go ahead and quickly show how this works. So I mentioned that we fixed this in IE8. So I'm in 9 mode right now. I'll just bring this up. And so I can get true that I actually have case-sensitive IDs instead of case-insensitive ones. In 8 mode, it's also true. But if I go ahead and switch over to 7 mode, I can see my feature detection or my behavior detection kick in. And now I know that I'm going to have to do some alternate code within my site. The key thing here is this will work in any browser that might have happened to have that bug, whether they were trying to emulate certain IE behavior and so they weren't explicitly identifiable as IE, or if it was IE itself. By the way, feel free to stop me if you have any questions while I'm going along. Okay, so the other thing I want to get into is kind of how this affects code execution within your site. So when you're doing version or browser detection, what you're effectively doing is pivoting to one of a very finite number of states. Even though you might have numerous detection points, they're all going to flip at the same time. Like if it's IE7 or IE8, you flip to one state or the other. So you effectively just get kind of 2 pages in one. When you're using feature detection, each of these different pivot points can be triggered individually, allowing your site to adapt to a much broader array of browser configurations. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the don'ts. Specifically, I want to focus in on some of the, the mental processes you might go through when you're developing your site. One of the things is just what, you know what works where. You've worked a lot with different browsers, and you've seen the different behaviors that they have. But the key thing to remind yourself is that a given feature that works in a browser you know about may also work in one that you don't. And specifically, that new browsers might add support for the feature in the future. Another question you might have is, specifically when you're detecting bugs, right? You think of it as, oh, this is a bug in this version of this browser. Of course, the same bug can, and a lot of times does, exist in other browsers. And the real thing you end up wondering about is if the bug's in the latest version of the browser, you don't know if it's going to be fixed when the next version of the browser is released. So you're basically, by doing version detection, rolling the dice a little bit and guessing, is that bug still going to be there next time or not? By doing behavior detection in those sorts of cases, your site will automatically adapt. And the cost here is the risk of breaking when new browsers are released. So let's take a look at some more code examples. We've got the canonical user agent detection I talked about earlier. But version detection comes in a lot of different flavors. Document.all using object detection is still really a form of version detection. You can also get this through libraries. Just because you're using jQuery, if you're relying on browser-specific detection through jQuery APIs, it's still browser detection. Specifically, the documentation for the jQuery.browser API strongly recommends against using this in your sites, and encourages the use of jQuery.support to do feature detection instead. You also can see this outside of script. This is a particular popular one, since conditional comments are an IE feature. And people have worked around CSS differences in IE6 and IE7 for a number of years. Now, the problem is something that we saw a lot when we shipped IE8. We shipped greatly improved CSS 2.1 support. But what we found is some sites would still display weird, and it wasn't a bug in the CSS support itself, but rather detection like this, where they're saying, oh, you're IE, so I must have to feed you the IE6 CSS, which won't display right in any modern standards-compliant browser. Now, if you have to do the version detection, because sometimes it is admittedly a little bit more complicated to do behavior or feature detection, make sure you target legacy only, because this is a lot safer. You're not playing that guessing game that I talked about earlier, where you're wondering whether something's going to be fixed or added in the next version. Things that have occurred in the past and have already been changed are a much more reliable form of something that you can detect. So I want to talk now about something that's a little bit more subtle. Version detection is pretty explicit, and it's pretty easy to identify in your sites. But assuming unrelated features isn't quite as much. The pattern goes a little something like this. You're using different features, and you're working in a particular browser. You've done good feature detection for a particular feature, and you know that this browser supports a few others. Since currently, at least in the browsers you're testing, you don't know of any other configuration, you might go ahead and use some of those features without explicitly testing for them. This can come back to be a problem in the future, and specifically a risk of your site breaking. But let me show you a specific example. In IE8, we also added a new API called PostMessage for doing secure cross-document messaging. And what we saw in one of the high-traffic sites that we were testing is that they did something effectively like this. Now, obviously, there was a lot more code in between, and so it wasn't as clear when you just looked at it. But they detected PostMessage and figured that at the time, every browser that supported PostMessage had support for add event listener, which we didn't add until IE9. So for IE8, this put it in a bad state where you would effectively just get a script error as soon as you tried to call add event listener. So if these practices are so good, why aren't we all using them already? Because there's still a number of sites on the web relying on version detection and using unrelated features. I mean, part of the problem is that version detection, you've got one solution you can use everywhere. You've got one piece of code you write. You don't have to change it when you use it at different points within your page. Here, each solution is a little bit different. It's also a lot easier to think in terms of what browser supports feature A or feature B. And it's a lot easier when you only have to think about having a single pivot. But the key thing to remember is the cost of following version detection practices as opposed to feature detection. Like, if you want to make sure that you take as much control as you can in developing your sites to be agile and adaptable into the future with new browser releases, taking advantage of feature detection is the way to do that. So now I want to show you a few examples of how feature detection looks outside of script, because we got into that at the beginning with CSS, and it's clearly more than just if-else statements in JavaScript. The CSS example in particular I want to talk a little bit more about when we're using border radius. The nice thing here is that it's kind of natural in the way that you automatically do feature detection. Browsers ignore properties that they don't recognize. So when a browser does early adoption using, say, -moz or -webkit, they can continue to recognize that property. But once they support the unprefixed version, that one takes precedent over their vendor prefix. Therefore, they automatically click over into using the standardized code path. Let's talk a little bit about HTML. Now, one of the things we showed the other day was HTML5 video, which I think a lot of people are excited about. And it's one of a number of elements in HTML that have built-in fallback mechanics. Sometimes it's for whether a given element is supported. Other times it's whether the particular video format you're trying to use is supported in the browser that you're using. The nice thing here is if that video tag fails for any reason, whether it's unrecognized by the browser or whether it doesn't have a codec for the video you're trying to load, it'll fall back to the content inside. Now here I've used an object tag, which has similar mechanics, but you can also envision nesting different video tags themselves. So if you want to have a video in one format and a video in another and use the video tag for both, you can just nest them right inside of each other. What gets a little bit more complicated is when you're dealing with things that don't have that type of natural fallback, such as SVG in HTML5. Here, older browsers that don't actually have the ability to recognize it will simply treat it as generic elements, and it effectively gets styled as a span, or if it's styled at all. Now, this is okay if your elements don't have any text content, because it just won't display, and you can provide some alternate content. But if you have some text in here, say you have a title or description or some other text that you're displaying as part of your graphic, what you're going to get is that text displaying straight up on the page with no vector graphics around it. So this is where I want to step into another demo where I can show kind of a preliminary detection technique that I've been working on, and I'm definitely looking for feedback. I'm not saying this one is necessarily the best practice. So what I've worked up here is I've got some SVG in HTML, which will work in IE9. I've got a description, which in SVG is hidden anyway, so it definitely shouldn't display when I'm running in an older browser. But the key thing here is it is text. And I've got some fallback content I've set up for when, or at least what I want to be displayed when I'm running in a browser that doesn't support SVG and HTML. Now, if we go ahead and look at that in the platform preview and Firefox today, switch over to 9 mode. So I'm getting the SVG I want in IE9 mode, but I'm also seeing my fallback content because I haven't really done anything special yet. If I go ahead and open this up in Firefox, I'm getting the text that was inside of my SVG block because by default it doesn't do SVG and HTML. There is a setting you can go and turn on yourself. And then I also get the fallback content. Now, this is definitely not the degradation experience that I want. And if I flip over to 8 mode, which doesn't do SVG and HTML, you see the same thing. So what can I do about it? Well, specifically, I'm going to try to avoid using script as much as possible because you can actually take advantage of some new CSS features that we've added in IE9 that are supported by the other browsers. Specifically, namespace selectors. When you create an SVG element in an HTML5 page, it ends up in the SVG namespace, which all SVG elements do. And so you can pivot on that from your script and from your CSS. So specifically, I'm going to set up a namespace of SVG here. I happen to have memorized the SVG namespace URL. And there we go. Semicolon. Now what I can do is actually use namespace-based selectors to target things. So first I want to set up the case where I'm running in an older browser. So just namespace unaware selector, I'm going to hide my SVG. Great. Now, I'm not really taking advantage of the namespace selector yet, but I want to show you where the progress is at the moment. Flip over. So I've also, unfortunately, hidden it in IE9. And in Firefox, I at least don't see the text I didn't want to see. So let's update it a little bit more. Now I can add a namespace-based selector, where I'm using my SVG prefix that I declared. And I'm going to go ahead, and if the element actually is in the SVG namespace, I'll turn it on. Now I get my content in IE9. And in Firefox, I'm at least not seeing the text. Now, the problem still is I'm getting my fallback content in IE9, so I've got a little bit more work to do. I can take advantage of namespace selectors again and the CSS sibling selector to target my div. And I'll just go ahead and turn it off if my element actually ended up being in the SVG namespace. Great, now my fallback content is gone, and it's still there in Firefox. Now there's one other little caveat given what I know about how different browsers handle elements. Older versions of IE don't actually create generic elements, they actually just collapse them when it doesn't know what it is. But there's a well-known workaround for this, specifically if you've ever created the element via script. So I'm going to add a script block. And so now this will cause IE8 and other earlier versions of IE to recognize my SVG element as a generic element. So if I go and refresh my 8 mode page, I get the same experience that I have in Firefox. Oops, meant to keep that over to the side. And then if I switch over to 9, I'm actually getting the SVG content that I want to display. Now the nice thing about this is, for the most part, I'm not relying too heavily on script, and the detection is pretty compact. It's also taking advantage of the fact that the SVG namespace is actually declared on this element. So it's only going to take effect when a browser supports SVG and HTML. So it's effectively a form of kind of a feature behavior detection hybrid. So really, the major call to action that I want to get across today is, if I haven't made it clear already, avoid using browser detection in your pages and use feature detection, behavior detection instead wherever you can. Now, I want to reiterate that I've walked through a number of the cross-browser challenges, set up some of the do's, and walked through some of the don'ts. But I want to show you a little bit where you can get a little bit more info. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up jQuery site here. And we'll do api.jQuery. Because this isn't just my idea. This is something that a number of people have been talking about for some time. And I'm going to go ahead and I'll switch over in just a second. Of course, the network connection would be a problem when you're trying to go to a website. Hopefully we're good now. Fantastic. So, like I mentioned earlier, jQuery actually provides you with a number of different pre-baked behavior feature detection scripts. So you can go ahead and just look at jQuery.support and then look for one of these properties to detect a variety of different types of capabilities and features without having to write all the tests yourself. So if you're using jQuery, it's a great thing for you to go ahead and depend on. Also, on their jQuery.browser page, they talk a little bit more about like why you shouldn't use it. And if you're really interested in understanding more about how to do feature detection, what the principles are behind it, and other examples that you can use in your own site, they link off to some great references with that type of information and explanation. In fact, one of these even has another set of pre-built tests that you can just go ahead and pull into your own site for use. But my hope here is that I've given you enough info today so that in the case where you don't have something pre-built, you can start thinking about these problems in ways that you can write some of the detection yourself. All right, so at that point, I am open to the floor to questions. If anyone has anything in particular, I can walk through some other specific examples, just anything you might want to know. Surely someone has something. Yes?
So, in your example, you're talking about, right, SVG, that was a IE9 minus scenario. And it breaks some rules of sending something out of the page that isn't usable in other browsers or other versions. And also the CSS3 implementation of unused selectors being downloaded. Is there any way to detect what's supported that way? Because you kind of break these rules. So if you send CSS3 selectors down to a browser that doesn't support them, like the specific WebKit or Mozilla, there's no sense in sending them down. Nobody can hear your question.
No.
You go to live?
Oh, yeah.
I can't, yeah.
Sorry about that.
In the earlier presentation about performance and things like that, you don't want to send down selectors to the browser that doesn't support it. And so in feature detection, can you detect which browser supports CSS3 selectors? And also, you don't really want to write a document.write to the SVG for IE9 or above. It's actually an IE9 minus scenario. Is there any way to detect that? Because it's unnecessary code. I know it's a very small example, but in larger sites, it affects latency, right?
Yeah, so let me talk to that kind of in the general principle because feature detection and behavioral detection does have, more so even behavioral detection, you're running a bit more code, and so yeah, you're going to incur a little bit of a performance impact. And it's a trade-off that you have to make when you're debating how to build your site. Like whether the performance optimization is something that is most important to you, or whether you want to make your site a bit more maintainable and adaptable. And a lot of times it depends on your specific scenario. Like if you're updating your site frequently and you're willing to go ahead and tune these things for specific browsers every time a new one is released, that might work for you, and that can work fine. And a number of the top sites do that because they know they have a very active development process. But this is a way that you can make your sites more resilient. And the perf impact of these, in a lot of these cases, is relatively small. Like, it's only if you're really wanting to squeeze every ounce of perf that you can. And from a user perception standpoint, a lot of these aren't going to matter. Any other questions?
Is this example going to be on the web later?
Yeah, I'll actually share out all of these examples. I have a blog post that will follow up on this, and so I'll share them out with that. You can just go ahead and go to the IE blog. If you need the URL, I believe we have it listed here. Yeah, so blogs.msdn.com/IE, and we'll have a post within the next week or so detailing this. Great. Thank you.